Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. This time around we're going to start off with a multi-piece miniature from the Pathfinder line. This is Dorella Krieg, and she's an ogre shaman, and you'd be right if you immediately thought that she hit every branch on the way out of the ugly tree as she fell down. She's wearing very little in the way of clothing. You can see sort of a strap bikini that she's wearing, a bikini top, and a loincloth. I'm glad for whatever she's wearing. I don't want to see what's underneath there. Face, like I mentioned earlier, is just ugly as sin, but that's appropriate for an ogre. And my first thought was that she would be perfect in a friend of mine's Ogre Kingdoms army. If you're building one for 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, I think you could drop her in there without a problem at all. You could certainly use her just as a regular ogre in D&D, Warhammer, whatever you might be playing. Or I think you could also drop her into a Revan army for Warlord. You can see in her left hand she's carrying a staff or a rod that's made up of a skull, and it has some almost like wings that come off the side of the skull. In her right hand she's carrying a staff, and it's kind of funny, it has some little, they really look like teddy bears that are tied up to the top of the staff. She has a couple of skulls or shrunken heads that are down on her belt, and a pouch on her back, a couple other little pouches to go around her waist. She's wearing sandals, and like I said, not much else in the way of clothing or armor or anything else. Assembly went pretty quickly. The head fits right on at the stump of the neck, and then her left arm, just a little bit above the elbow, fits into ball and socket joint up on the upper arm part. Cleanup was limited to some mold lines here and there. There was a visible one on the left side on her hand that ran down, and then also on the inside torso area on her left side there was a mold line that had to be cleaned. That one was a little harder to get to, but after a minute or so it was taken care of. So good all around, very ugly ogre shaman model here, but I think there's several uses for it. Next up are several Warlord miniatures, and the first one is actually going to find its way into my Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay campaign. Maybe my Revan army for Warlord, but I'm not really sure. But this one is an Orc Painmaster, and it's a single piece model. You can see he's carrying a short spear in his left hand to poke somebody with, and he has a whip that's coiled up in his right hand, about to sling that out or whip somebody with it. He's got an apron on, sort of like a butcher's apron, which I'm sure gets very messy. He has several tools in the pockets, so he is very obviously some kind of torturer. There were a few mold lines here and there that needed to be cleaned up, but the most significant cleaning was at the end of the spear. There's a tab of metal that connects down to his boot just as part of the casting process that's there, so that needs to be clipped off and cleaned. You want to be careful not to bend the spear when you're doing that. He's got heavy boots on that have spiked toes. Not a whole lot else in the way of clothes. There's some vambraces on his forearms, but that's really about it as far as clothes are concerned. He, like the ogre we looked at a minute ago, is really ugly. He's got a warty face that's really flat, looks like he took a shovel to the face. Just an ugly specimen of an orc. I'm not really sure if he's suited to get dropped into an Orc and Goblin army for Warhammer Fantasy. Obviously he'd work in his role in a Revan army. I think he might be suited as a squig herder or something like that in Warhammer Fantasy, but not so much a frontline fighter or a leader of a group. I think he has good use in a role-playing scenario, so that's what I'm going to use him for in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but I think it's a pretty cool figure. In this next pack you get 4 Arachnid Archers for the Darkspawn army, and these actually come from the P65 line that we talked about last time around, but they are releases for the Warlord line of miniatures. In the pack you get 4 spider bodies, or lower halves, and 4 upper halves, which are the torso, arms, and head of the Dark Elves or Corrupted Elves that make up the model. So if you're thinking Drider right off the bat here, that's what I'm thinking also. I have lots of these that are being used in a D&D campaign right now. We're about to get into the Queen of the Demon Web Pits, so got lots of use for them there, but I also think you could drop them into any fantasy role-playing game if you weren't going to use them in Warlord. All of the elf torsos are topless, so on the 2 female ones, there are some bits there that you might want to watch out for with the kids. I really didn't see it as anything objectionable, because you can't really tell anything because it's a very smooth surface, if you get my drift. Anyway, cleaning consisted of some small metal webbing, some thin webs of metal that were around the bulbous part of the spider part of the body, and also on each of the archers there's a tab of metal that runs from the bottom of the bow up to their torso that needs to be clipped off, and then after that they just pretty much fit onto the spider part of the body in a ball and socket joint. So they go together pretty easy, not a whole lot of cleaning needed, and if you wanted to, you could bend the spider legs a little bit to get them to fit onto a 40mm square base. They don't come with bases, they don't need bases, but if you were going to use them for some kind of alternate Warhammer Fantasy Army where you're using the Darkspawn models in place of something else, you could definitely get them onto 40mm bases. And if you're interested, there is also a version of the Arachnid Warriors that have swords and shields instead of bows, and you can see them right here. Next we have another model in the new Dark Elves that are coming out in the Savage North supplement. This is a Dark Elf Sorceress. It's a 3-piece model where you have the staff in her left hand. The staff and hand itself is a separate piece that gets glued on to her left arm that's raised up in the air. On her right hand, she carries a smallish kind of dagger, and that fits into place right at the shoulder. And you do have some posing options here. I have it up in the air. You can have it down towards the ground or pointed towards the ground like you have in the picture here. Either way is fine, but she is done in the same style as the other new Dark Elves, so she has big wild hair and flowing robes. Even though they look kind of tattered, it all looks uniform in the army when you see a lot of these models put together and sitting by each other. I did find a faint mold line on her right thigh, but that cleaned up quickly, and assembly was easy. I'm just happy anytime new Dark Elves from this line come out. I love all of them, and so far they can just do no wrong in my eyes. Okay, let's move into some Chronoscope miniatures now, and this new 3-pack will get you 3 different robots. 2 of them are single-piece miniatures where there's no assembly or anything, just a little bit of cleaning needed. Each of the robots here had a few bits of flash and some minor mold lines, but nothing bad at all. The larger of the 3 robots had a couple pieces that went into it. There's a small gun that fits on the right side. It really just mirrors what's on the left side, except it is a little bit of a smaller gun than the one on the left side. And then there are 2 larger guns that are cast as a single piece, and this fits onto the back of the model, and the guns just carry over the shoulders. I think you could use these in a D20 Future game, maybe in Champions or Mutants and Masterminds if you had a need for robots or anything like that. Pulp City, you could use them as robots in that game also. And I've read on the Reaper forums that these have absolutely nothing to do with Cav whatsoever, but if you don't have a use for them in a normal sci-fi game or something like that, where you could use them as a player character robot or even a war droid or something like that to challenge the party with, you could get a lot of use out of these guys in any kind of 6 or 10mm sci-fi tabletop game. I could even see them getting dropped into Epic 40K if you're playing that. This last guy is my absolute favorite for this episode, and it's not really because I have a specific use for it, it is just from a coolness standpoint. This is Rumscratch, and he's a dwarf Wershark, and it comes in 2 pieces. The bottom half are his legs and the shark tail. It's sort of a stubby shark tail like you might expect for a dwarf. His right leg is a peg leg, so that didn't grow out when he turned into a shark. And on his right foot he has a boot, there's a pistol in his belt, there's a nice little seashell down on the base, so the little bit of extra detail there. Now, when he turned into a wereshark, he broke through his pants, so you can see the tail comes through the pants and kind of breaks through there, so when he turns back into a regular dwarf, his bits are going to be in the wind. The 2 halves fit nicely together at a square peg and void joint right at the middle of the model itself. On the top half you get a sailor's coat, and he has a little hermit crab that's sitting on his left shoulder, so like the seashell on the base, another little added detail here that I like a lot. He's got a hook that replaces his left hand, and he's trying to hold up a small treasure chest. In his right hand he carries a cutlass, and he's in a very threatening pose between the cutlass that he's raised up ready to attack with and all of the teeth that are visible in his now shark head. Excellent model here. It is full of character. There's nothing I don't like about this model. I just think it's wonderful. He'd make an outstanding player character model in a Seaborn fantasy type adventure game. I could see dropping him into a group of pirates for War Machine, even though it doesn't really fit necessarily with the steampunk kind of atmosphere in War Machine. I think it'd just make an outstanding, unique model to put in an army. But if you don't want to use him for that, I think he'd also make an ideal captain of a band of pirates to use in an encounter against some player characters in D&D or another fantasy game. Thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. We'll see you next time.